Nice to see everyone, be here. I am glad winter is over, or at least took a break. Gives me so much joy, which is what we're going to be talking about. So let's turn to the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to start there, and then we're going to jump back and forth into the Gospels. But we're going to start the book of Ecclesiastes. One of my favorite books in the Bible. I know for some that's crazy to hear, but for others, they're like, yeah, that's great, but it is. It offers a unique perspective on life, and it gives us something that we have to think about at some point in our life. It's a good blend between the Proverbs and the Psalms, but many of us, when we think of Ecclesiastes, we think, man, that's just a negative book. So negative, and it can be. It opens up with words such as Ecclesiastes 1, verses 2 through 4. Futile, futile, laments the teacher. Absolutely futile. Everything is futile. What benefit do people get from all the effort which they expend on the earth? A generation comes and a generation goes, but the earth remains the same throughout the ages, right? Everything is pointless, and that is pretty bleak, because we don't want to hear that everything we're doing and have been doing is pointless and meaningless and a waste of time. Sounds very, actually, nihilistic, if you will, that movement that's now becoming more popular. In fact, if we compare, for a second, just these two verses here with the definition of nihilism, which is the belief that the rejection of all religions or moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. What did we just read? Futile, futile, laments the teacher. What benefits do people get with their work that they expend on the earth? What's the difference here? And that's the confusion that we can have when we take things out of context. We start wondering, because it's negative, where is God in these texts? But as we keep reading and we keep reading, quickly we find, look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 13 through 14, God comes up. But the second half of verse 13 tells us, and I'm reading it out of a different version than the ESV, so it's easier to understand for everyone. I conclude, God has given people a burdensome task that keeps them occupied. I reflect on everything that is accomplished by man on earth, and I conclude everything he has accomplished is futile, like chasing the wind. So what's the point? What's the point of living here? Because in messages and truths like we read here in this thesis statement, if you will, it can seem hard. It can seem hard to find God. And the writer throughout this book will often tell us that certain schools of thought or actions or ventures is just pointless and vain. And it's hard to wonder, well, how? How if God created this world? But the thing is, we often read Ecclesiastes and we start there, and then we end at the very end of the book, at the last chapter, at the last few verses. Look over there in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, which is very necessary in understanding the book. But if that's all we focus on, we lose the true meaning of the message that this is trying to relay to us. Because that's just one conclusion. That's the final conclusion of several conclusions that the author makes. Let's read that if we jump ahead in verse 13 of Ecclesiastes 12. This is the final conclusion. Having heard everything, I have reached this conclusion. Fear God and keep his commandments. Because this is the whole duty of man. For God will evaluate every deed, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. How do these passages fit together? How do we start off with everything man does is futile and pointless, like chasing the wind, and then end over here with fear God and keep his commandments? How do we tie these verses together? Before we understand what those mean to us and how we tie that together, we have to understand what the rest of this book is telling us. Because if we just spew these verses out to people that have no concept of faith, that you should fear God and keep his commandments, well, without context, that sounds to them like a pretty miserable existence. And you may have heard it said that, well, at least from them, that that's no fun. Right? Why do Christians have to suck all the fun out of life? Why does God have to be a part of every aspect of my life, they'll say? How is that going to make me happy in a world that is meaningless? right? Because in a world that's meaningless, all that matters is my happiness. And that goes into this idea of chasing this hedonism, if you will, this hedonistic idea that we live for the greatest pleasure and good and happiness that we can find. But what we realize as disciples of Jesus, that's not our goal. That's not our goal. What we find instead when we read Ecclesiastes is that fearing God, keeping His commandments is the greatest existence that we can have. It is. It's not just the purpose of you and me sitting here and worshiping God. It's the purpose of everyone. The whole duty of man, as it says there. The whole duty of man, of mankind, of humanity, as it says. The intention was for everyone to fear God and keep His commandments. That was the main goal. But then to seek God comes with an extra bonus, the possession of joy. And if you read the book of Ecclesiastes, and you just underline and you just highlight everywhere joy is mentioned, what you'll find is that, and joy is mentioned a lot, by the way, so is God. Every time joy is mentioned, God is mentioned. The two go hand in hand. The writer literally cannot mention joy without also mentioning God. They are inseparable. And this evening, let's look at this book again. Yes, which offers a very realistic idea on life, but look at it in positive aspects on this book, on life, that can easily be overlooked. The goal of this lesson is to read God's Word, His truth, with a happy heart. And when we read Ecclesiastes, there's these three areas of life that seem to show up. And God is saying, if you don't have me in your life, these three areas of life are going to suck the joy out of you, and we don't want that. Let's look at the first time joy is mentioned. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. You look at we're going to start verses 22 through 23. After God in this chapter breaks down that it doesn't matter if you have all the material things in this world, all the big projects, it doesn't matter if you have all the wealth, you could be the Elon Musk, the Jeff Bezos of the world, that is not going to guarantee your happiness. It's not. And honestly, they're probably not the happiest people on the planet, if we're being honest. And yet, all we concern ourselves with are the material things of this world, physical things of this world. I imagine many of us would give a lot to be them. And we want to be them not because we want their job and their anxiety and their responsibility. We want wealth because we want their luxury. We want their luxury. And what we'll find, luxury, or no matter how hard we work in order to achieve that luxury, is not going to gain us happiness. Verse 22, what does a man acquire from all his labor? From the anxiety that accompanies his toil on earth. All day long, his work produces pain and frustration, and even at night, his mind, it cannot relax. This also is futile. You know, the other day I was looking at a painting again we have on our mantle from a very special lady in my life that passed away. I just got to thinking about it and looking real closely at this painting, and you realize that this is leftovers of them, if you will. Every brushstroke, every color that they picked out, the thing that motivated them and moved them to make this painting is from them, and this painting continued on even past their own life. It's so neat to think about. Then you think about your own life, and you realize, man, that's not going to last forever. That painting, as much as I would like it to, is not going to last forever, as much as I'm not going to last forever either. You look at verse 22 again, and we can work so hard for something only for it to produce anxiety and sleep deprivation. But God goes on to say, no, further than that, further than your work or the job that so many people try to find purpose and meaning in, God says further than that, verse 24, there's nothing better for people than to eat and drink and to find enjoyment in their work. I also perceive that this ability to find enjoyment comes from God. No one can eat and drink or experience joy apart from God. To the one who pleases Him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy. But to the sinner, He gives the task of amassing wealth only to give it to the one who pleases God. This task of the wicked is futile, like chasing the wind. There's the idea of chasing the wind again. If we go out in the streets and we ask people today, what is your purpose? Many of them are going to come back, well, whatever their job is, their occupation. This is how I fill my time. This is what I do on this earth. I'm a cop. I'm an accountant. Whatever that is, that's what they'll say their purpose is. Excuse me. Our job is not our purpose. As Christ's disciples, what we realize in verse 26, what is our purpose in this life? A part of our purpose is pleasing God. That is a piece of our purpose. And we are to please God in our jobs, yes, and in whatever that we do. Only then can we find enjoyment in our work, as it says there in verse 24, because what? Verse 24, enjoyment comes from God. We experience joy because God is a joyful God. He's not a boring, miserable God. He is a God of joy. Another example to think of life without God is to think of someone trying to get healthy and doing nothing about it. That's what living life without God is like. It's better to have a small workout than do nothing. It's better if I want to increase reading to read at least one page instead of not reading at all. Whether a good or bad decision, it's better to make a decision than no decision at all. Something is better than nothing. And in a physical world where everything is futile, the wicked, those who fail to live for God, it's like doing nothing. It's eternally meaningless. But to live for God, that is something. Why? Why is it something? Because everything to us. Everything. I love verse 25. This truth here that says one cannot experience joy apart from God. Joy is something to be experienced. And our ability to find enjoyment, it comes from God. What we experience, the blessings that we have, the happy moments in life, the joy that comes from our faith, even when we struggle and then we improve, it's a gift from God. Fearing God, keeping His commandments, is a way that we please God. And according to verse 26, what does God give to those who please Him? He gives knowledge and wisdom and joy. And our faith is accumulation of those things. It's applying those things. Our faith is accumulating our knowledge of the Scriptures, applying that knowledge that we read in Ecclesiastes, and that wisdom that we gain from that application, the joy that we experience in relationships. And when we view our faith that way, it changes everything. Our faith isn't a drag. Our life isn't a drag. We're not trying to get out of bed, dreading to get up and start a new day. No, we're excited to start a new day. We're excited to start a new day because God has given us that day. I love what Jamie made, the point he made this morning in class, right? God's mercies are new every day. And as we draw closer to God, we draw further into our joy. Whatever we decide to do, whatever God calls us to do, we're to do it because out of joy, because we have God in our life. Verse 24 again, read that there. This is what God desires from all humanity. There's nothing better for people than to eat and drink and to find enjoyment in their work. There's nothing better. God, throughout the Scriptures, is telling us a positive message on life. That in the midst of darkness and meaninglessness that's brought about through sin, there's this beacon of hope and light. There's this joy here, and God is behind that joy. And it reminds me of when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the people around him, and he's saying, are you looking for joy? Are you looking to find pasture and to be saved? Well, I am that door. In John chapter 10, verses 9 through 10, for those seeking joy, Jesus says, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved. Right now we have joy. And will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief, sin, Satan comes only to steal, to kill, and to destroy. Right? That's what brings the meaninglessness and makes life futile. But Jesus says, no, I have come so that we may have life. And have it what? Abundantly. Abundantly. We possess an abundant life of joy with Jesus. And yet so many humans look for that joy. They look for abundance. They want abundance, but they look in the wrong areas of life. Many of which Americans are obsessed with. Work is one of them. Right? We want to find purpose in our work. We want to find a job that we love. Politics is another one. If I can vote for this person or that party, if I can pass this law, then people will be saved. And then we have time. Time is another aspect of life that we can be easily obsessed with. How can I get this done as fast as possible? What's the most efficient way to do this? That is really the American culture if you think about it. Work, politics, time, and yet I find myself often obsessing over these very things. But when God says, no, there's something greater, something more important that you need to be focusing on, we focus on that thing. In fact, our focus on God makes our relationship with these things a healthy relationship. Because we're focusing on what's more important than just the material things of this life. That second one, politics, is a big one. Politics I'm referring to as in the governing authorities, which is meant ideally to execute this justice. But because us humans are flawed, we see corruption. Politics is a good one to mention in this lesson, and Ecclesiastes brings it out. Because for us, in our culture today, it's become everything. Everything is surrounded around politics, the idea of politics, even to our very own identity. We're struggling with identity politics here. It's become so crazy. It sucks the joy literally out of everything. We turn on the TV, we open up our phones, we read, we just in a waiting room. We cannot escape it. And yet I love what Jesus says in Matthew 22. Let's look at Matthew 22 for a second. Where Jesus, he's talking to the Pharisees. The Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus, but he comes out with wisdom that we see in Ecclesiastes as the rabbi, the Messiah, the teacher, and he doesn't fall into their trap. Matthew 22, look at verses 15 through 17 here. And start in verse 15, this is about paying taxes, where it tells us, then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words. And they sent their disciples to him, along with the Herodians. And Herodians is an important detail here, because Herodians is mentioned here, and then 2 other times in the Gospels. That's the book of Mark. The Herodians were those big supporters of King Herod and the Herod dynasty. They had their hands deep in the political theater of that day. And yet, this is a very important detail. Every time the Herodians are mentioned, so are the Pharisees. Every time the Herodians are mentioned, so are the Pharisees. And yet we read Ecclesiastes, and every time joy is mentioned, so is God. Do you see a pattern there? That tells us that the Pharisees, the Herodians, they were in this agreeableness between religious leaders and political leaders. They were working together in corruption. Is that what we want people to see in us when we engage in conversations like this, when we post online, when we tweet or we follow people on social media? Because we can see that. And we leave a digital footprint, if you will. But we continue in our text, and notice they ask Jesus, they pop him up a little bit first, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true, and teach the way of God truthfully. And you do not care about anyone's opinion. You're not swayed by appearances. Tell us then what you think. Right? Just his opinion. No harm, no foul. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Do you think what they say about Jesus in verse 16 is true? Seems so. It absolutely is. Jesus is not swayed by anyone's opinion. He's not afraid of other people's thoughts or ideas. He's not swayed by influence or appearance like so many of us today are. Jesus cares about one thing. Look at verse 16. He cares about one thing. It's teaching the ways of God truthfully. There's application for us in our own life. When we look at our life and we're struggling to find joy or to have joy, we ask ourselves, what do we care about most? What are we focusing on right now? Is it enjoyable to pay taxes? No. And that's what they That's what they ask. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? They try to trick Jesus. And yet, how does this lesson pertain to joy? Right? We don't want to pay taxes in tax season right now. It's not fun. It's not a charity. We literally have a metaphorical gun pointing at us telling it, pay your taxes. And in the first century, the income tax was something new to them. And many of them literally had a Roman sword on their throats telling them they need to pay taxes. And Jesus, without them even realizing it, is telling them, I need you to choose the path of joy. To give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to give to God what is God's. That's the path of joy. There's a separation there, and there's no joy when we are like the Pharisees and the Herodians, when we are obsessed with politics and we're frustrated and upset about taxes and this law and that policy, and it goes on and on. Pay your taxes, move on, and focus on what is really important. Right? The source of our joy in life, and what is that source? Teaching the ways of God, truthfully. It doesn't matter how unjust taxes are, or whatever injustice we see in the world. Focusing on that leads to misery and distraction, never to the eternal joy that God brings into our life. The idea here in Ecclesiastes comes out, and we're going to look back at that. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 8 verse 14 here, which tells us, look, there's injustice in the world, but yet God's way stands as a road to joy no matter what happens. It's simply just a fact of life. Because of sin, there's corruption, there's evil and injustice, and we can't rely on government or whatever document or law to somehow eventually give us happiness and joy. It's not going to happen, and God warns us of this fact, verse 14, saying this is an enigma. Here is another enigma that occurs on earth. Sometimes there are righteous people who get what the wicked deserve. Sometimes there are wicked people who get what the righteous deserve. I said, this is an enigma. Now that injustice is something that we see every day when we scroll down in the news, when we look at the news, and yet God says, this is difficult for us to understand. We're not going to understand. It's vain to try. And what is our job? When we suffer, when we see injustice, what is our job? Is it to throw a fit? To harm those because we feel powerless and so we act out in violence? No, it's to love God, to love others, to work, to enjoy life in spite of the injustices of this world, as God commands us to. Look at the following verse. What is the prescription here? The prescription is in verse 15. So I recommend that in the enjoyment of life, for there is nothing better on earth for a person to do except to eat and drink and enjoy life. So joy will accompany him in his toils during the days of his life that God gives him on earth. When we have God, joy is not something that we're looking for, that we're constantly looking for. Something that accompanies us right there. We have it on our journey. We have it with God. Read that again. We enjoy life. And then we have, even through our turmoil struggles, we have joy. Paying taxes, the injustice of the world, we have joy. God recommends the enjoyment of life. He's literally telling us to enjoy life as a prescription from what we see and experience, not as an idea of what might happen if we do A, B, C, or D. No, but as a verb, to do something now, as an action, to be joyful in the present moment. Because to be with God is to be with Him eternally present. And at the end of that verse reminds us that God gives us each day as a gift. Are we going to live our lives in joy or in turmoil? Right? The idea is not to allow the injustice that sin brings into the world to affect our soul, because God's injustice is what we will eventually rely on. In God's justice, that's where pure fairness and equity and equality live. Pure joy that politics strives for but never achieves. And the last thing there is time. Time can really suck the life out of us if we allow it. Time is often what we run by. It can quickly become our idol. To the modern man, time can be an idol, right? We can worship the God of time, and it's easy to have an unhealthy relationship with it. We wish we could have more time. If only we had more time, we could do this. If I could go back in time, well, then I could be better. Well, that's one of the biggest illusions in life, is that our improvement is based on how much time we have. Our ability to improve is not based, to really improve on who we were yesterday, is not based on how much time we have or how much time we wish we had. It's based on how we focus, who we focus on. It's dependent on our focus on God. Time is the allotment of improvement, not the basis of improvement. And God speaks to this fact in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Look at verse 2, reminding us of this undeniable truth we all live in denial of every single day. That verse 2 of Ecclesiastes 9, everyone shares the same fate. The righteous and the wicked, good and the bad, the ceremonially clean and unclean, those who offer sacrifices, those who do not, right? So the religious, the non-religious, what happens to the good person also happens to the sinner. What happens to those who make vows also happens to those who are afraid to make vows. The question is, if we share the same fate, if we will pass away, if who controls that fate? God controls that fate. God, the Creator, who's outside of space and matter and time. All the more reason why we should draw closer to God. The God who can take away our soul and our life. We should fear God, not time. If we only have an allotted amount of time, we really only have two choices: to hate life or to enjoy life. Hate life or to enjoy life. Time can become a real reason why we hate life. But when we live for a God who's outside of time, why should we hate life? In that instance, as God's people, we are essentially living life outside of time. Now, we can't control how much time we have or how much time we would like to have. As much as I would like to hop into a DeLorean any day, it'd be nice, but we can't. We have to serve God who gives us only so much time and be stewards of that time. Look at just another example of Jesus. Turn to Matthew chapter 6 and look at verse 25. Because Jesus, he's trying to comfort those that are stressed and anxious about life. And he tells us in Matthew chapter 6, do not be anxious about your life and what you will eat or what you will drink, nor the body and what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Sometimes life to us can be just about eating and what we're going to wear. That's all life is about. And those two things we think about on a daily basis because they're necessary. They're a necessity for life. We can't live without, eating and drinking. Flip that around and apply that to Jesus. Can we say the same thing about Jesus? Is the same thing true? Is he something that we think about every single day because we need to? Because we want to desire him, because we can't escape his love for us. Is God a necessity for us every single day and for our faith? Anxiety, angst happens when we give control to those things, the physical things like the clothes and the food. Instead, we're told, no, relinquish that control. Relinquish it. And then joy comes in. Look at verse 27, for Jesus goes on to say, and here's that idea of time again. And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his lifespan? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Jesus here is referencing wisdom that we read in Ecclesiastes. We all share the same faith. In fact, you could even say that same thing. You could say that line in verse 27 with joy and happiness. Which of you, by being happy, by being joyful, can add a single hour to his span of life? You can't. Because we all share the same fate. And yet, which life would you want to live? Right? A life of anxiety or joy? Right? We want to live a life of joy. You see, and this is an important application, we are often anxious about things like clothes and food because we live life chasing after those things, chasing after more instead of enjoying them, instead of enjoying what God has given us. He's given us a gift. And because life is brief, Ecclesiastes chapter 9, look at verses 7 through 8. God says, go, eat your food with joy and drink your wine with a happy heart because God has already approved your work. What work does God approve? Does he approve of lust and adultery and drunkenness and abuse? Does he approve of those things? No. No, he doesn't. He approves of those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for his righteousness that comes from him. In verse 8, so let your clothes also always be white, and do not spare precious ointment on your head. The two very things Jesus said, don't waste your time being anxious about. God says earlier in Ecclesiastes, look, stop chasing after those things. Enjoy them. Stop chasing after them like chasing after the wind because they're a gift from God. It's perfect harmony. Sometimes we think of our faith as having to abstain from these things, joyful things in life, because we're told that we need to be disciplined. And we absolutely do need to be disciplined. But these verses are not telling us to sin, to indulge with impulse or abuse. None of that. Absolutely not. If it did, it would not mention joy. Because joy does not come out of sin. It doesn't. Not out of sin or abuse or impulse. It comes from God. It cannot be experienced apart from God. Only way that we can find joy in this life is because God is in our life. Because he's given us this life as a gift. And he has approved our work as his people. We're able to enjoy life. And now we're able to be his stewards. And this is an important detail to remember as we close. God is not saying or telling us to live life without these things and without people. He's telling us to love him more. To love Jesus more. And the more we love Jesus, the more we love God, the more we love the life that he has given us, the more joy we have. This evening's lesson is simply just a prequel to our lesson next Sunday morning, where we introduce a new sermon series on James, where the book opens up in chapter 1 with the idea of joy. You need to be joyful when we're going to struggle. But it's beneficial for us to understand why we are joyful, why we have joy. Evening's lesson is just a time where we can be joyful. We can be happy for the life that God has given us. And I pray that we can leave here with happy hearts as we read in Ecclesiastes. We can apply this joy to our life. Not being distracted, seeking God. Not being distracted by work and politics and time and making those a primary focus. But again, seeking God. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is Psalm 70, verse 4, which tells us, may all who seek God rejoice and be glad in him. May those who love his salvation say evermore, God is great. If we can do that, and as God said in Ecclesiastes, we can enjoy life, the life that God has given us. And then we can apply the end of the book in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 through 14, to our life. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's not meant to be a drag. That's meant to be an enjoyment. Joy in God. Joy in God. And Jesus is that connection. That connection between those verses. Joy in Jesus is that connection that brings everything together between the meaningless of life and our duty as mankind to fear God and to keep his commandments. We need to be able to do that joyfully. What brings us joy? Despite the burden of the meaningless of life, God teaches us that life is chock full of joy, just as we saw in these verses, and we can so easily overlook, because God has given us more reasons than we realize to love life. And if you don't love the life that God has given you, you're having a hard time finding joy, seek Jesus tonight. Be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. That is one of the most joyful moments in our life, to be baptized, to be saved, to enter into His pasture, to live life abundantly. So we can say, God is great, and we can live with a great God. If that is what you want this evening, come forward now while we stand and we sing.